All right, we're going to continue with early Byzantine art. Where I want to start is where we left off with Hagia Sophia. And one image we didn't talk about yet was 9.8, and it's the actual interior of Hagia Sophia. And you can see the inner workings of that central dome and all the different glassware that was placed all the way up at the base of that dome, where it branches off into those 5 points. That's why we call it the pinnatives. And I want to compare that with figure 9.9, which we already talked about, which it looks like there's 4 points. Okay, so the pinnatives actually are more present in the imagery of Hagia Sophia with 9.8. So you can see two all the way to the far southwest, then two more adjacent coming back towards the photograph, and then one that's coming down over the photograph directly. So those are your 5 points, and within those 5 points it creates new forms of archways, and then the furthest southwestern 2 points of those pinnatives that come down create that apse. And remember, the apse is the main place of worshiping. And that's going to be the ritualistic activities that are occurring within Hagia Sophia. And I say religious activities because during one period of time it was Judea activity, then it was Christian activity, then it was Islamic activity, and then it went back to Judeo-Christian activities, and predominantly Christian activities. So you're going to have that apse as like the central part of religious ritual and worship within Hagia Sophia throughout all these different years that it's been constructed. But with figure 9.8, just see that that's an interior dome, and you can see all the glassware that's being developed to allow this natural light to come in, which is really, again, the importance and presence of what they would consider illumination, which is synonymous with heavenly divinity, and that's why that glassware is there, to give that atmospheric presence. And don't forget that glass at this time was very expensive. It was not cheap, so you would only really see glassware within these architectural structures, these churches, and different synagogues and different places of worship. Okay, so that concludes Hagia Sophia. We'll talk about it again whenever we discuss Islam, and we'll come back to some of these images, and you're going to need to be able to cross-reference the Islamic influences upon Hagia Sophia whenever we get into that in chapter 10. Now we're going to jump to San Vitale, and San Vitale is really quite an interesting piece of architecture, and we're going to start with figure 9.8, and I want to start right away with what are called flying buttresses. You have there in the image to the very bottom right those two kind of half hemispherical archways that are attaching to the exterior of the building. That's a flying buttress, and again, that's added later. That is something that is not original to the San Vitale structure. And another thing is look where this is built, Ravenna, Italy. And that means that this central plan that originated in the Far Eastern Roman Empire in the Byzantium area was brought all the way back to the western part of the Roman Empire, which was Rome and Italy itself. So this structure did not originate in concept in Western Roman Italy. It was originated in Eastern Roman Empire in the Byzantium, Constantinople area. But it just shows the influence between the two different factions of the Roman Empire, that these concepts, these architectural designs, made their way over to Italy, to the far western sections of the empire. All right, so what we have, if you look at figure 9.11, is again what's called that central plan. Okay, and that central plan is because it has a dome in the middle of the structure. Okay, it still has the apse, but it has that dome on the pinnatives. Now this is a little different. With this dome, it's actually more elaborate and more expansive. It has 8 different points, 8 different sides. So it's a little broken up based off of the concept of the dome of the pinnatives. So it's more elaborate and it's more expansive. So by them doing this and creating this dome that is more elaborate and has multiple more even points instead of the odd points that we saw with the 5 in Hagia Sophia, it requires some actual structural support. And that specific type of support you need to know, and it's called an axial support. And that axial support is being given to the dome with the 8 different points from the apse. And this is a very uncommon configuration. And there's something else that's very uncommon about it as well. I'll talk about that here in just a second. But the first and primary thing is the requirement for structural support of the dome that has 8 points instead of just that 5. I always question, well, why don't art historians up to this point call it the dome of the octatives? Because that would be 8 points of contact. But that's never been reworked into the vocabulary. They still keep it as a dome of penitentives. But it's an elaborate dome of the penitentives is what they say instead of renaming it. And one of those sides, of those 8 sides, needs to rest upon the top of the apse, which is very uncommon because there was not this structure. The apse was very separated from everything because it was the ritualistic location of religious activities. But in this case, it's being required to support this very elaborate dome. And that support system, again, is called an axial support, AXIAL support. And the reason why and the other anomaly or obscurity that makes that apse require to be required for support is because of that narthex. And that narthex, again, is that entryway just outside of the atrium. And in this case, the narthex is incorporating the entryway or the atrium. And the reason it is because this was developed on a very important street in Ravenna, Italy. Okay, and they wanted this San Vitale on this very busy street, so people were going by it all the time, coming in, and they wanted its orientation to be placed upon this street. But because of the orientation or the arrangement of the street, there was no room for an atrium. So the narthex, if you see number 1 on figure 911, is a little slightly disjointed in relation to the rest of the structure. And because of its disjointed configuration, there's not enough counter pressure for that dome to equalize towards the entryway of San Vitale. So the apse on the other side of San Vitale has to compensate for that lack of structural integrity because the narthex is a little obscured and it's in a very odd place in relations to the symmetry of San Vitale. It makes it very asymmetrical, which was again a very uncommon thing, if not rare, for them to do whenever it came to architectural structures for religious worship. They wanted the symmetry. Their symmetry showed the order within this world. But because of that street, and they really wanted to build on the side of that street, and they didn't rework the road, the San Vitale was designed in this asymmetrical way. All right, so that's kind of the breakdown of the overall orientation of San Vitale. And what's going to happen is, again, there's not going to be a heavy use or influence of actual three-dimensional sculptures. There's going to be that working of mosaics that we saw in late antiquity. And remember, we talked about the tesserae. Remember, not tesseract Marvel Comics, but tesserae, which they both actually mean ethereal in nature. So ethereal presence upon the earth is really what tesserae and tesseract mean. So the whole Marvel Comics thing is pulling from this period of time in ancient late antiquity and Byzantinum. And that technique, that tesserae, is going to be the cutting of small pieces of glass and translucent material found in glazes as well as marbles, and that are slightly opaque but mostly translucent, so that it grabs some of the light and then illuminates it out. Okay, kind of like this ethereal presence. And the reason that the early Christians did this is, again, to give that emphasis on a divine presence within the artwork that's being constructed. So these mosaics are going to become the key element to the finer arts whenever it comes to religious imagery at this time. The whole idea of three-dimensional sculptures and all that is going to really kind of take a big back seat. And it's all going to be about the architectural churches and synagogues that are being developed that are going to become the sculptural aspects. But again, these mosaics are going to have a big part of the imagery inside of these buildings. And we have figure 913, Justinian, and Bishop Maximanius and his attendants as one of the mosaics that's within the north apse of San Vitale. And it's going to set up a very particular type of style, almost like a Byzantinum style at this time, that's going to be derived from that late antiquity style that I mentioned. And if you remember, those two main things to recall from chapter 8 with the late antiquity style is going to be using that tesserae, which has that light within the eye sockets of the figures, so it looks like their eyes are moving with the light whenever the light hits them. All right, very similar to like when you take a picture of somebody and they're looking directly at the camera, and you place that picture in your home, wherever you go, those eyes are going to follow you. It's the same kind of concept that they use using those little cut cubic pieces of glass and glazed and marble pieces. So that's one. And the second is going to be the flatness and the clustering of the figures and that symmetry on both sides, okay, to give an important recognition to the central figure of the mosaic. All right, we've looked at Good Shepherd with Christ, and we've looked at Abraham and Lot in their departures, and we've looked at these parables and these stories, these biblical stories that feature these late antiquity styles. And now we're going to look at how that is being superimposed upon the importance of Justinian. And essentially, Justinian's placement in these mosaics is going to be in association with the importance of Jesus. So he's going to start donning different stylistic characteristics that were placed upon Jesus in the earlier mosaics, and now it's going to be about how he is a representative of he, so to speak, through these different stylistic features. Okay, so what these are is, let me just break it down based off of my notes so that you have it all in your notes, and then I can elaborate a little bit more. Is what's happening in figure 913 with Justinian and the bishop is it creates what's called a formula, okay? And the formula is that the emperor is going to be in the center. So Justinian is in the middle of this composition, okay? That's the first thing. Just like what we saw with the earlier mosaics, the prime biblical personalities and people were in the center of the composition. Obviously Jesus and several of them, and then also his apostles and followers and representatives of he being in the center, and the others. Okay, so that's the first. So the emperor is now being centralized, all right, which is nothing new, but now he's being centralized based off of his religious Christian connection with the development of Judeo-Christianity in this area. The second is the purple robe. That purple robe, which was originally used to reflect regality and earthly regality for Jesus in Good Shepherd that we saw in late antiquity, is now being garmented and donned by Justinian. And also there's going to be another one, Theodora, which is his wife, his queen, that's also going to be donning this purple robe. Okay? So by them having this purple regal attire, it shows that they are representatives of Jesus. Okay? So by placing that upon him, it gives it this subliminal connection to he. So that's another style. Third is left of the emperor, so to his left, is going to be the next important person. And that person in figure 913 is Bishop Maximinius. Okay, so the bishop is going to be the second echelon of importance. And it's based off of his placement to the left side of Justinian. Okay? And the bishop is the one, Bishop Maximinius is the one who had San Vitale built. So he was the chief architect behind the making of San Vitale. And if you notice above his head, his name is actually the only name on this mosaic. His name is there in Latin, Maximinius. Justinian's name isn't even on there. All right? But because he's centralized, we know that this is about him. But it may not be noticed right away based off of history who the bishop is. So his name is actually inscribed in this mosaic. All right? And now we have to look at the feet. Well, wait, before we look at the feet, one last thing is the halo. There's a halo present upon or in the background of Justinian. And that halo, of course, is supposed to represent that he is this elevated and enlightened divine individual that has his thoughts constantly geared towards the worship of Jesus. Okay? So by having that halo, it indicates this effulgence is supposed to be that any action that he takes is going to be on behalf of Jesus. Okay? That's just the fine arts technique and style in particular that I'm talking about. This isn't a world religions, a argumentative on contrasting and comparing different world religious and propaganda elements. It's not about that. It's just I'm telling you the fine art styles that were used at this time that were continuous and consistent throughout a lot of these mosaics. And that halo on showing the emperor, Justinian in particular, is a reflection of his devotion to Christianity and to Jesus Christ. Okay? So now I want you to look at all their feet, which may sound silly, but the arrangement of their feet actually has a lot to do with their importance. Okay? So the emperor and his staff will be having their feet the furthest in front. Okay? So they will have the furthest in front. Now, then the clergy, the bishop and the clergy will have their feet second closest to the front of the composition. Then the soldiers, which is the third tier, will have their feet furthest back. So 1, 2, 3. So the emperor and his followers will have their feet in the front first. Then the bishop will have his feet with his clergymen in the front second. And then the soldiers will have their feet in the back third. So it creates this, even though it's flat and it looks like they're all in the same field, the same ground is what it's called, their feet are actually not. So it's a way to show depth, and it's not a physical depth, it's a social religious depth. So the importance of the individual. And if you notice, with the bishop and his clergy, it looks like they're in the front because their feet look like they're the closest to the front of the composition of the mosaic. But if you look at Justinian and you see what he's holding and his purple robe, it's in front of the bishop. So it's disjointed. The lower portion of Justinian and his clergy and his followers appear as if they're in the back, but his upper body, from his navel up, appear as if they're the ones closest to the front. And the reason for that is appreciation for the bishop and the work that he did to have this San Vitale constructed. So half of Justinian is in the forefront, and then the other half is in the back, behind the bishop. But with the bishop, the lower body and his clergymen are in the front, and then the upper body is behind Justinian. So it's a deliberate technique to show the importance of the bishop and the religious clergymen, but also that Justinian is the one that had this constructed, that he is the one that's allowing these constructions to be built. So there's kind of a, I guess, an egalitarian placement of the bishop and Justinian within this mosaic. All right? But if you look at the feet of the soldiers, they have overlapping feet of the clergymen and Justinian's followers. Behind, so his followers' feet are on top of their feet. Okay? So that indicates that the soldiers are there for the importance of, conquest for this Eastern Roman Empire, but their feet are further back and overlapped by the feet of Justinian's followers. So that indicates that they are third, Justinian and the bishop are half and half, sharing the first and second place, so to speak. It just depends on kind of the socio aspect of Justinian being the emperor, and then the bishop with his religious importance being the head of San Vitale and the religious worships during this time with Justinian. Okay? You should also be able to take this from figure 913 and look at figure 914 and do a similar comparison with Theodora and attendants. This mosaic will have a similar reflection as that of Justinian and the bishop. Okay, so be able to kind of look at both of those, see a little bit of the differences, and see and look at those feet and see who has more importance and who doesn't, and who's central to that composition. So 914 will be Theodora, and then figure 913 will be Justinian and the bishop. Okay? So be able to break that stuff down and know those different styles and how those are Byzantine styles coming from late antiquity to reflect the importance of socio-religious placement within these mosaics. All right, we're already going on 20 minutes just talking about one piece, so I'm going to stop the video here, and we'll make another one for you and conclude early Byzantine art and move into Middle Byzantine art.